we will discuss Herrera Murry Chapter 5 and 6. Let's first start with Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, Herrera and Murry discuss a framework of accommodation readiness for English language learners or culturally and linguistically diverse students. However, when Herrera and Murry use the term accommodations, they're not discussing testing accommodations like extra time or a modified test. Instead, they're talking about accommodations in general, often how we would consider differentiation, how educators are meeting the individual needs of each student based on their academic ability, their language proficiency level, and their interests. It's important that teachers understand that they check their assumptions and their past conceptions or preconceptions of English language learners and culturally and linguistically diverse students. It's important that they realize that English language learners have just as much intellectual ability as any other student group, and they are just as proficient or just as capable of learning at high levels. It's just a matter of learning how to best educate them and to best meet their needs. It's important that teachers reflect on whether their past assumptions of English language learners are actually factual based and based on research, or are they just assumptions that don't really have a lot of underlying reasoning behind it. If teachers have past assumptions that are incorrect, they need to adjust those assumptions and to modify and learn more about culturally and linguistically diverse students through research, taking classes, and professional development. Level 2 of accommodation readiness is when the teacher is ready to interact with English language learner students and families. So culturally and linguistically diverse, CLD, students and families. And so during this stage, the teacher finds ways to identify students' prior language experiences, the language used at home, their prior academic language experience, and their academic interest and their goals. And so the teacher will use semi-structured conversations like open-ended questions between the students and the teacher, and also the teacher and the parents to better understand the student. And so through this, the teacher understands how they can make the content most relevant to students and how they can access prior knowledge and build background from what students already know. Level 3 is environmental readiness. And so this is when the teacher starts to think, what kind of external environments affect the student? So what issues are going on in the region, the state, the country, etc.? Or, for example, how will that student be assessed? Or what expectations does the state have for the student's academic progress? Moreover, the teacher starts to provide the instruction that is best for their students. Regardless of, let's say, the end of the year test, the teacher makes sure that the students are learning all of the content objectives and learning critical thinking skills that will help them later in life. And so for practices that are policies that do not benefit students, the teacher works on behalf of the students to speak out on the students' behalf and to make sure that they're defending their students' learning progression and their students' right to have an effective education. And so the teacher spends a lot of time focusing on the internal environment as well. They make sure that their school and their classroom are very positive learning experiences in which students can still respect and practice their culture and language while also developing a knowledge of the English language and the English culture. And so teachers can make sure that their classroom environment is positive, supportive, welcoming, and it promotes multiculturalism and tolerance of different beliefs, and how all students respect each other regardless of whether they actually hold those same cultural beliefs or not. And so the teacher also thinks how they can best support collaboration among students or in cooperation, and also how they can help develop students' higher order thinking skills or critical thinking skills in their lessons. So they're thinking about the best types of engagement strategies and instructional practices for their English language learner students. Level 4 is curricular readiness. And this is where the teacher understands the objectives that they must teach to English language learners and the scope and sequence of the district. So what the district expects students to learn at what time, and what assessments the district will give students to assess how they've been progressing and learning the content, and when do those assessments occur. And so if a teacher is aware about what's going to be assessed during and what time, they can go back and plan for that to make sure that their students are ready for the assessments and that the teacher has taught all of the necessary content material for those assessments. Furthermore, teachers are ready to provide curricular scaffolds, like to provide visuals, hands-on learning activities, manipulatives and realia, also setting up heterogeneous language partners, high-low language partners. Teachers know how to identify and where to locate differentiated texts for different reading levels, how to incorporate graphic organizers to help students organize information and to demonstrate their thinking. Furthermore, students also have curricular readiness in terms of how they can modify instruction. So how can they, what pace they should use based on the students' listening comprehension abilities, what parts they should repeat or emphasize, or which practice needs additional practice more than others, how they should pre-teach particular vocabulary concepts or main concepts, and then when at the end of the lesson what concepts they must review to make sure students understand them correctly. Finally, we have level 5 and 6. So level 5 is when the teacher is ready for programming and instructional readiness. And so they understand the program model that the school has to serve English language learners, and teachers not only understand that and how to best support English language learners learning, but also they can even design their own new program models. So if the school is using a model where students' native language is being minimalized or removed from the classroom, the teacher can advocate to have more learning opportunities in students' native language. Moreover, the teacher can ensure that the teachers, families, and students work together as a collaborative team to participate in the decision-making process. And they've done studies that show that when teachers and parents are in regular communication, this helps facilitate students' learning. And also, when students have choice in what they're learning and in the school environment, then they're more engaged. Finally, level 6 is when the teacher has readiness for application and advocacy. So in this situation, the teacher understands the theory behind language learning, so they've been reviewing what we've talked about today. They understand that there's a flexibility in instruction and that how instruction should be differentiated based on the unique needs of the student, and also based on the unique needs of the school classroom environment. And so there's not just this rigid one-way approach, but teachers find what's best for students and for what they have. And so they make sure they differentiate their instruction to meet the individual needs of each student. Furthermore, teachers are at a stage where they can advocate for their students. They not only are fluent with the curriculum, they already are well versed in what students need to know and how to teach it, but furthermore, they have the ability to support their students both in the school system, in the individual classroom, of course, and at the local level as well in educational decision-making policies. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Stay tuned for future lectures on chapter 6 and 7, in the Herrera Murry book, and also chapters 8, 9, and 10 in the Herrera Murry book. Thank you. We are going to now discuss Herrera Murray's chapter 6. It's important that we go over two terms that Herrera Murray used throughout the chapter. First is approach. An approach is basically the overall theoretical system or the overall educational philosophy that teachers are using to best support the learning of English language learners or culturally and linguistically diverse students. Next is method. A method are specific strategies or techniques that teachers use to best support student success. But the fundamental theory behind it is based off the approach. So approach is the broader, overarching umbrella concept, and then methods are the specific ways that teachers help support student learning. Let's discuss our first approach, grammatical approach. The grammatical approach is a teacher-centered approach in that the teacher is largely in control of the learning, and that they are largely the ones posing questions to the students. They're picking the types of assignments or activities students will be working with, and they're doing most of the talking. The students are not having a lot of choice in terms of what activities they're learning or how they're demonstrating their knowledge. They're more responding to the teacher. Furthermore, a second aspect of the grammatical approach is that students are learning language from the memorization of rules, the memorization of vocabulary, and the memorization of sentence patterns, often through memorizing dialogues. And so the key concept is that ideally, according to this grammatical approach, students will keep on memorizing it and put it into repeated practice so that it becomes a habit. Almost like it becomes clockwork when they need to recall that information because it's been a habit and they've put it to memory, they'll be able to quickly be able to recall that information or that vocabulary or that sentence in the proper context. There are three particular methods or techniques in which teachers can apply the grammatical approach. The first method is the grammar translation method. Next is the direct method, and third is the audio-lingual method. I provided a short summary of each of those methods on this slide, but we're going to actually go into depth of each of these methods in the following slides. So if you don't fully understand it just by seeing this brief summary of each one, this brief description, we'll go into more detail in the following slides. Let's discuss the grammar translation method. And if you would like, you could click on this link if you have the downloaded PowerPoint, or you can also just copy and paste this link, or you could even go to YouTube and search for the grammar translation method. And if you search for that, hopefully you'll come up to this video. I feel like this is a good demonstration of how the grammar translation method would look like in the classroom setting. I want to quickly describe the history behind the grammar translation method. The grammar translation method is certainly not new. It's several centuries old. And even the earliest universities in the United States used this type of method to teach foreign languages such as ancient Latin and ancient Greek. The idea was that students would learn the grammar of those two languages, and they would use their grammar knowledge of ancient Latin and ancient Greek to improve their first language grammar. So students at Harvard, for example, were taught to learn ancient Latin and ancient Greek 200 years ago because the professors and the educational leaders of that university felt that if students learned the grammar of Latin and Greek, they would learn more about English grammar and become better writers and better speakers. Another theory behind the grammar translation method was that even though students were learning dead languages that they might not use in person or in conversation and everyday use, and they were developing their overall cognitive ability. Since those languages were difficult to learn and required a lot of critical thinking, the theory was that students would develop intellectually, and so their thinking ability would improve, and then they could use that in other subject areas such as history, math, engineering, business, or on the job in whatever profession they chose. There are some important principles of the grammar translation method. The first principle is that the purpose of language, or the purpose of learning a language, is to read literature in that language, to read articles or to read stories or nonfiction prose in that language. And that is more important, according to the grammar translation method, than learning how to speak that language. Furthermore, the grammar translation method focused on students learning the high culture of a country or a language. So students focused on learning the literature and the fine arts. Like they would be reading the plays, or they would learn about the famous artists in that culture. But they wouldn't really learn about the everyday modern culture that the countries that speak that language have today. Furthermore, a key principle of the grammar translation method, like the name sounds, was that students were asked to translate from one language to the other. So they would learn the definitions or the translations of common verbs and common vocabulary terms, and they would learn how to conjugate those verbs. But when they were reading those ancient texts in ancient Greek and ancient Latin, the goal was for those students to translate what they were reading back into their first language, English. And so the vocabulary and grammar were a key focus, and reading and writing were emphasized above listening and speaking, especially since most of these languages were dead languages that they were learning. There wasn't a lot of opportunities to have listening or speaking. So most of the instruction was grammatical practices, writing practices, and reading ancient texts and translating them back to English. As we mentioned earlier, the grammar translation method advocates that students focus on translating from the target language back to their first language, their native language. And so most of the language actually spoken in the classroom is probably going to be students' first language. And as we mentioned earlier, students were taught and encouraged to memorize vocabulary words and to memorize their translation back into their native language, as well as to understand the verb conjugation so they could translate literature back into their native language. And this might be how you learned a foreign language in school. I know that especially in my Spanish 1 class and Spanish 2 class, a lot of the time we were taught common verbs and verb tenses, and we were taught how to conjugate them. But when we were reading texts, or when we were reading dialogues, or working on worksheets, we were encouraged to translate the language back into English. So we weren't really thinking in Spanish per se. We were thinking in English, but using that to conjugate in Spanish. And so we weren't really utilizing the language directly to communicate and to talk to each other and to write in the language. We were primarily filling out worksheets, how to conjugate verbs and to write short phrases. And in the end, most of the time, we were thinking in English, thinking about how we could compare what was written in Spanish back to English. Let's go move on to the direct method. These two videos are excellent examples, so I hope you will look at them at your own time to see some nice classroom applications of the direct method. The direct method is slightly different than the grammar translation method in that instead of translating back into students' first language, translating is actually not allowed according to the direct method. All of the communication is in the target language, and students do not get help in their native language. And the emphasis of the direct method is on speaking. So reading and writing are taught and they are practiced, but the most important thing that's emphasized is students being able to listen and understand what is spoken to them in the target language, and also communicate through speaking in the target language. The teacher will often illustrate vocabulary with real objects or realia, or they'll use pictures to aid comprehension. Because, like I said earlier, since there's no translation allowed and students can't use their native language, they need contextual support such as realia and pictures to understand new words, because it won't be explained to them in their native language. Some principles of the direct method are that vocabulary should be acquired through speaking and listening to complete sentences. It shouldn't be memorized. So it's very different than the grammar translation method, which focused on memorization. So vocabulary should not be memorized, but language, complete sentences can be memorized. So students practice with short sentences and they memorize the patterns, and they also memorize how to pronounce properly the letters in the language, and then students continue to practice that. Eventually, through repeated exposure and through repeated practice, students develop their own understanding of the grammar. Similar to how people learn grammar naturally as children, when you're a baby and probably before you enter third grade, for example, you still were able to speak in the present tense and the past tense and understand the difference between the two, even though they weren't necessarily explicitly taught right away when you were in kindergarten. It was something you kind of picked up naturally by listening to your siblings and to your parents and other your teachers and other people communicate to you. Now let's talk about the audio-lingual method. And you can click on either of these videos or both of them to see how the audio-lingual method can be put into practice. The audio-lingual method is similar to the direct method in that students can only use the target language. They can't use their native language for support, and they're not encouraged to translate either. So it's very different than the grammar translation method. The audio-lingual method is an oral-based approach in which students learn primarily through listening and speaking. The one thing that's unique about the audio-lingual method that's different than the direct method is that the audio-lingual method always starts their lessons with a dialogue. Students hear a dialogue. It's normally acted out with the teacher providing gestures or some kind of contextual support like images or costumes, and then students are taught to memorize that dialogue. And the idea is that through conditioning and repeated exposure and practice, students will memorize that dialogue and know in which situation they could use that dialogue. When educators instruct using the audio-lingual method, they teach language in specific contexts. So they might give dialogues in which students have to ask for something at the grocery store, or order something at a restaurant, or ask for help on the job site. As we've mentioned earlier, for the other two approaches that are part of the grammatical approach, it's a very teacher-led approach and a teacher-led method, because the teacher is the one who's in charge of modeling how to correctly pronounce the dialogue. The teacher is the one that actually picks the dialogues for students to read. And then the teacher provides lots of feedback along the way to make sure students are pronouncing everything and memorizing the right dialogue at the proper pace. And so the teacher's largely in control, and the students are more passive, responding to what the teacher asked them to do or to the teacher's questions. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, repetition and habit learning are a key component of this method. The idea is that with repeated practice, students will develop a habit of using that language in the correct way. The audiolingual method supports the idea that errors should be quickly corrected. And since students are asked to memorize and build into habit the dialogues and the phrasing of certain sentences, if the idea is that if students memorize the incorrect use of language, then they will continue to have that misconception for years to come. So whenever students make errors, the teacher immediately corrects them and ensures that they understand what was their error and how to improve it and what's the correct usage or the correct pronunciation or the correct phrasing, so that students put that into their long-term memory. Similar to the direct method, but different than the grammatical translation method, the audiolingual method focuses on students learning how to communicate and learning phrases or dialogues that could be useful. One way that students start to expand on their ability to express themselves in more variety and to add vocabulary is the idea of having a slot spot of each part of speech in a sentence. So if you look at the example, I play basketball, there's 3 slots or 3 parts of speech. The subject is I, the verb is play, and the object is basketball. Each of those have a slot and a spot, and the teacher can choose to have one of those slots vary each sentence. So for example, students can practice with different types of objects, including sports or games. So the subject I and the verb play would stay the same, but the object would change. So it could be I play football, I play cards, I play soccer. You could even add in musical instruments. I play the guitar. So students learn new vocabulary, but they're still repeating the same sentence structure to memorize that and to memorize the grammar and to also build a habit. Another part of the audiolingual method is that positive reinforcement is regularly encouraged. The idea is if students are positively reinforced and given praise, it will help them build strong habits and will help them know what is the correct way to communicate. The concept also entails that grammar and structure can be memorized and can also be expanded upon. So we already had a simple sentence in the slide before, but here's another one. He cooks dinner. So there's 3 slots or 3 parts of speech: the subject, verb, and object. However, once students master that simple sentence with just the subject he, the verb cooks, and the object dinner, then students can expand on that. A teacher can give them something a little bit more difficult by adding things like an article and an adjective, an adverb. So if you look at the next sentence, the hungry man quickly cooks dinner. We added the as an article. We added hungry, an adjective that describes the subject man. And we also added quickly, the adverb that describes the verb cooks. So the idea was that students first master the simple structure of a sentence and then they expand based on their knowledge of grammar. So since grammar and the whole slot spot method was heavily emphasized in the audiolingual method, theorists who practice the audiolingual method argue that grammar and language structure should be learned first. Once students master the grammar or language structure, then they will start to learn more about vocabulary and to expand their vocabulary. Once again, as we mentioned earlier, students repeatedly practice simple sentences and then they gradually get more advanced. And so grammar is not necessarily explicitly taught, but students memorize those patterns and it gradually gets more. And eventually, through repetition, students learn what is the appropriate grammar, even though they might not be able to explain what exactly is the grammar rule. Through habit and through repetition, they know what is correct. The audio-lingual method, once again, focuses on using dialogues. There's also the concept of slot substitution, which I mentioned before, where one part of the sentence is changing so that students have additional practice, but they still repeat the other parts of the sentence. They just modify that one part to add new vocabulary. Another concept that's interesting in the audio-lingual method is the practice of backwards buildup, or sometimes people call it the expansion drill. So using the audio-lingual method, teachers will also identify what areas students are mispronouncing or what areas students are having difficulty with. And first, teachers will emphasize that one word or that one part of the sentence that students are having trouble with. And so once students master that part, they can pronounce it correctly, they know, they can identify what it means, then they go back and put it into context, into the entire sentence. So if you have a sentence like conduct, with the word conduct, and maybe students are having trouble pronouncing it, you would first focus on teaching the word conduct and having them pronounce it correctly and understanding what conduct means, like behavior. And then you would have students put it back into context, into a complete sentence. Like, students should have good conduct. So the idea is that once they master the most difficult part of the sentence first, the other parts that they're more familiar with and comfortable with will flow nicely along, and it'll be easier to say the whole sentence once they've mastered the most difficult part first. As you may have already guessed, there are several critiques of the grammatical approach of each of those methods: the grammatical translation method, the direct method, and the audio-lingual method. The first critique is that often students really don't get to practice language in authentic situations. They're memorizing dialogues or they're practicing translating back into their first language, but they're not really practicing how to negotiate meaning during a time when they have difficulty expressing themselves. So, what happens to a student when they go to that country or they meet a native speaker of that country and there's some situation that they haven't memorized the dialogue or memorized the vocabulary? What will those students do in that context? They might often struggle because they're not used to learning how to troubleshoot or work around difficulties in understanding between the two people in the communication or the conversation. The second critique of the grammatical approach is that most of those methods focus on the academic function of language. It doesn't necessarily develop students' ability to understand the everyday slang or the idioms of that country that is currently speaking that language. And students are not really practicing how to use the language in social contexts or even in work-related functions. And so, unless the student is always using that language in academic situations, they might struggle in their communication. The third critique of the grammatical approach is that often the instruction is not comprehensible, or it's not comprehensible input. So many times students are asked to do drills, but those drills or those dialogues or those short sentences that they repeat over and over, it is not authentic conversation. Not everyone speaks in such simple sentences where it starts with the subject, verb, object, or not everyone has the same few sentences they say when they go ask for help at a store. And so the problem is if students don't see the relevance of what they're learning, they don't see that it could be about how they could use their speech in different situations and the benefit of it, they're just made to memorize it, they might not find it relevant to themselves, and they probably will be less likely to store it in their long-term memory. A fourth critique is that educational research has shown that using the grammatical approaches are not as effective as other methods. So the grammar translation method is significantly ineffective compared to bilingual education, where bilingual education would have students learn the content and the information and develop their first language proficiency. So they would, for example, learn about the history subject in their native language. And then the idea was once they develop their native language and they have a strong foundation in their native language and they have lots of content knowledge in their native language, they can transfer that to their second language, the language that they're trying to learn, their target language. And that research has shown that bilingual education is a lot more effective than the grammar translation method, where students are just being asked to translate from their second language back to their first language. Moreover, in terms of the direct method and the audio-lingual method, they have done studies, and a lot of times students get lost because it's all in the target language and they're not allowed to ask for help in their native language. And even providing some of those supports do not necessarily mean that students will understand each dialogue or what's being said in the dialogue. And so a better, more effective way to instruct students in the target language is through content-based ESL programs, which follow the SIOP model, which we'll learn in future lessons. The communicative approach is our second theoretical underpinning of how to teach language. So the communicative approach, like the name sounds, focuses on students learning a language for the purpose of authentic communication in real life, real world situations. Students are asked not to memorize rules because the idea is that memorizing rules is nearly impossible. There's an infinite number of combinations. And so if you just memorize grammar rules or simple sentences or simple dialogues, you might not always be able to use that specific sentence or that specific dialogue in each situation. Furthermore, the teacher and the classroom will provide context and opportunities for students to use that language in authentic situations. So the teacher will find authentic texts that are used by people who speak that language, maybe to communicate at the workplace. Or the teacher will use real modern vocabulary terms and phrases that students use in that country to communicate in specific situations, like at the store or at the movie theater or in the park. The learner will also receive comprehensible input. So the learner will be taught information at a pace that they can understand, and the words taught to the student and the ability level or the difficulty level, the rigor level, will be only one step beyond students' current abilities. Furthermore, communicative approach, each of those methods advocate that the environment should be a low anxiety environment, so students do not feel stressed and worried about what people think of them or making mistakes, because that could interfere with the amount of information they retain. If they're too worried about what other people think about them, then they're not going to be thinking about what actually is being taught, and they will be less likely to remember that information. So students are encouraged, and the environment is a positive, welcoming, low-stakes, risk-free environment so that students do not feel anxiety. Furthermore, the environment is supposed to be full of language, so it's supposed to be a language-rich environment. There's positive messages written in both the target language and students' native language. There's language across the classroom. There's books of bilingual books or books in both languages, the student's native language and the target language. and the materials that students are using, the books, the texts, the games, the activities, they're the same types of activities that they would see in the real world, or the same types of activities native speakers would engage in their home countries. A second part of the theory behind the communicative approach is that people have a natural ability to learn language and to learn the structure and grammar of a language. Similar to some of the other theories that we taught before, such as the Audio-Lingual Method, grammar is not explicitly taught in the communicative approach. The theory is people will just naturally learn through repeated exposure, hearing the language over and over, and practicing the language over and over. The communicative approach advocates that environment and the language learner will affect how much of the actual new content or new language the student remembers. So if the environment is not conducive to learning, if it's a stressful environment or there's not any language present in the environment, it's just the bare walls with no books, students are likely not to learn as effectively as a language-rich environment that's positive and encouraging. Also, the language learner has to be motivated and find the content relevant so that they'll be more likely to retain that information and be paying attention and engaged in the lesson. Furthermore, the teacher's job is to facilitate students' language learning. They must provide the language-rich environment, and they have to provide regular opportunities for English language learners to collaborate, which will allow them to learn and practice how to negotiate meaning with native speakers. So English language learners are being exposed to people who are native speakers who speak fluently and speak accurately. And so English language learners will know how to converse with them and will gain additional vocabulary from their more proficient English-speaking peers. They'll also have practice with learning how to circumlocute, or how to work around barriers in communication. So if they have trouble explaining something in one way, they can learn how to explain it in a different way. Or if they have trouble understanding what the person is saying, they have the ability to ask for clarification and to make sure that they're understanding exactly what the speaker's intentions are. There are 5 specific methods to teaching students language through the communicative approach: the silent way, the natural way, Desuggestopedia, or sometimes just Suggestopedia for short, integrated content-based method, and the sheltered instruction method. The silent way contends that silence should be a tool in which students become independent and they become the center of the learning. So the teacher is encouraged to say as little as possible and to encourage as much student communication and peer collaboration and peer correction from the students. So the teacher will only interfere or only provide the minimal amount of speech possible, and students are expected to help each other out and to correct each other. This way, the theory is, students will become more active in their learning, and that learning will be more student-centered. In the silent way, or according to the silent way, listening, speaking, and pronunciation are first emphasized. Later, after students learn how to listen with comprehension and to speak and pronounce the words correctly, then students are taught to learn how to read and write in that language. This is probably one of the most important elements of the silent way that you should remember. The silent way provides interesting types of scaffolds, since teachers are encouraged not to speak very much. So since teachers cannot really provide a lot of detail or speak to the students in the target language, and even less in the student's native language, teachers are encouraged to use visuals and manipulatives such as color charts, colored rods, real objects or realia, or hand gestures to help students learn more and to make sure that students are pronouncing the words correctly and using the words correctly in the right sentence structure and context. This is important since the silent way focuses a lot on the teacher remaining silent during the lesson, and a lot of times students are only the ones that are really correcting each other. At the very end of a lesson, the teacher will ask students to reflect on their learning, and the teacher will ask the students in their native language to provide the teacher with feedback about how they felt about the lesson and what concepts they think they need to practice more and what they would like to learn in the next lesson. And there's a couple benefits of that reflection period. First of all, the teacher knows what students need additional practice with, how students are feeling about the lesson, and this teacher can further gauge if students really comprehended what was taught during the lesson. Furthermore, the teacher knows what students would like to learn next, so they'll have an idea of what's the most important information or important language that students want to learn. And so teachers can directly teach what students are interested in and what students find most relevant. Furthermore, because students are asked to reflect on their learning, they gain additional responsibility and additional independence and autonomy and control over their learning. So when students have more choices and more control over their learning, they're more likely to be engaged and interested in what they're learning. After they have the reflection period, students will then practice writing sentences that they've created using those tools such as the color charts or the symbols or the rods, and they'll practice with those sentences. They'll practice with speaking, reading, and writing those sentences. And the idea is that all three language domains, speaking, reading, and writing, are interrelated. And so based on what students heard during the lesson and what they said out loud and what they repeated with their teacher's gestures or teacher's indication on the color chart, then students will connect that together and write based on that. The second method in the communicative approach is the natural way. The natural way has students build comprehension through listening. And once students understand what they're listening and they feel confident of what the speaker is saying, then they are later asked to do things like speaking, reading, and writing. The natural way focuses on modifying the language and making it comprehensible for the student to understand. So they slow the pace and they provide lots of visuals, realia, and hands-on learning experiences to make sure that students are understanding what they're hearing. Furthermore, similar to some other methods in the communicative approach, the language that's chosen for the lessons are supposed to be high interest and high frequency words and concepts that students will see regularly throughout their academic career and in their everyday lives. And so the language is supposed to be meaningful, and also the environment is supposed to be fun and low stress. Desuggestopedia or Suggestopedia has many of the same qualities as the natural way, and they have many things in common. I hope you'll click on these links to see how Desuggestopedia is implemented in the classroom setting. Desuggestopedia argues that students should be desuggested that they're going to fail. By that means students should not have any negative feelings about studying the target language, and they must view studying the target language as fun, easy, and important, exciting. The way teachers do that is by implementing and integrating fine arts into the way students learn language. So teachers will often read a dialogue to students while also playing music in the background. Or the teacher might have students listen to popular songs and have students repeat and sing those songs. Furthermore, while students are learning new lessons or new vocabulary, they might also be asked to act out those words in a play, which is another type of fine arts, or to visually represent and draw what they're talking about through art. Desuggestopedia focuses on developing a classroom environment that is positive, warm, inviting, and exciting, full of lively activities. One way that teachers do this is by having educational posters throughout the room to provide a peripheral engagement of the language. So students are seeing educational posters written in the target language and seeing visuals in the target language. And so wherever they look, they're being exposed to the target language, but it's in a low-key way where it's not necessarily in their face where they have to look, but they can choose to look, and they look at what interests them. And when they look at those images or those posters, then they might remember those phrases or those vocabulary words. Another interesting part about Desuggestopedia is that often teachers will have their students create new identities or new nicknames in the target language. And the idea is that if students create new nicknames and new identities, they'll feel more open to try out new tasks and to take risks. They'll take it less personal if they make a mistake because they're thinking like they're a different person, a new identity. So they'll feel more open and comfortable and confident and less likely to be discouraged or anxious if they make mistakes. Also, it makes it seem more fun and play-like a game to students. Desuggestopedia argues that students should learn words that they can use immediately. So the most important, the most high frequency and direct words that they can apply immediately into the classroom and into conversations are the words that are taught. Songs, as I mentioned before, are used to learn language and to develop positive emotions and connections to the target language. Grammar and vocabulary are taught, but they're not heavily emphasized. And then kind of what we mentioned with making up their own nicknames and the idea of role play and fine arts, students are encouraged to learn in a state of infantilization. So basically, they're encouraged to learn as if they were very young, how they first learned language. So they learn through music, through movement and play and games and casual conversations, similar to how they learned their first language as children. Desuggestopedia features students also reading dialogues in the target language, but unlike the audio-lingual method where they just read the dialogue in the second language, the target language, and they don't necessarily know what they're saying or all the words, what they mean, students are encouraged to read the dialogue first in the target language, then translate it back to their first language to understand the meaning of what they're saying, and then practice with the dialogue again in the target language. And when students are reading the dialogue, often the key vocabulary words or key grammatical concepts that the teacher wants to emphasize will be in bold print. So even though the teacher doesn't have to keep on reiterating out loud, look, focus on this concept, or, ooh, this is really important. Instead of doing that, which could give stress or cause students to maybe push back on that emphasis, the emphasis is kind of subtle. And so students just naturally realize, that's an important word. Or, this phrase must be really useful in this language. Desuggestopedia follows a specific order of learning. The first order is the receptive phrase. So in the receptive phase of learning, students first listen to the dialogue while music is played. And the idea is that this will activate both sides of the brain. Also, it's similar to how people first learn language. They learn through listening. Later is the active phase. In the active phase, students start performing the learning activities that and using the words that they heard in the dialogue. And they'll practice with them through games, singing songs, doing dramatization or plays, acting out, and also question and answer exercises. As we've discussed already, Desuggestopedia focuses on the most important vocabulary that students can use immediately when they're speaking. And learning vocabulary and speaking in general are the types of activities or the parts of language that are most emphasized. Students are evaluated or assessed through their performance in the learning activities, such as the games, the songs, the dramatizations. The idea is that students will not be assessed on tests, especially multiple choice tests, because tests would be too stressful and students would be less likely to learn or engage with the language that was demonstrated on the text because they feel lots of anxiety and fear, and they'll be less likely to remember what they've learned. A fourth method in the communicative approach is the integrated content-based method. The integrated content-based method contends that students should learn language, they should learn new vocabulary, practice speaking, practice writing in specific content areas. So while they're still learning grade level content in math, social studies, and science. This way, students do not fall behind in learning the grade level content, and they're learning language and improving their English language proficiency simultaneously at the same time. A key component of the content-based method is that instruction is always at students' language proficiency level. So the teacher is aware of what listening ability students currently are at, or what listening proficiency they are at, and the teacher makes sure to modify the pace of instruction, the types of words the teacher uses, and how often the teacher pauses for clarification or to check students' understanding and for students to practice with the content based on students' language proficiency level. So students with a very basic listening ability will probably need the teacher to go very slow, provide lots of contextual support like visuals, gestures, multimedia, and repeated modeling. And then they also will need to have the teacher pause maybe after every 30 seconds or so to make sure students understand what the teacher is saying. However, students who are very advanced in their listening proficiency in English will be able to understand longer instructional cycles, such as a short lecture or maybe reading from a text that takes 5 minutes and then later discussing the text. They won't necessarily need everything to be broken up into small little pieces or little chunks and to always be reminded of what they've learned, because they can comprehend and retain most of the information in English since they are familiar with the vocabulary and are familiar and with the grammatical structure and have a good listening ability. Something that's important about content-based method is that there's an emphasis on thematic units. So a lot of times students will be taught key vocabulary for certain themes or units, let's say under the sea, and then later the teacher will try to implement and have students practice with that vocabulary and that sentence structure in different contexts according to the subject. So, for example, if the theme was under the sea, students might learn the science behind what kind of organisms live under the sea, or how the sea gets its oxygen for its animals. And then the teacher might also provide math word problems that have the same vocabulary used to describe, there are 100 sea lions in the sea and 20 go up to the beach. How many are left? If you have that kind of vocabulary and students are still practicing with the math skills, but they're also practicing with the language skills and the vocabulary. And then they might read nonfiction expository articles about animals that live in the sea, or about how large the sea is, or environmental concerns affecting the seas, cleanliness. And they could also be asked to write about their favorite animal in the sea, or write about something they've learned. And so through repeated practice and seeing the vocabulary in various contexts and different content subjects, students are acquiring that vocabulary and becoming more proficient in being able to express themselves when discussing that theme, such as under the sea. We are not going to go too much further into the integrated content-based method, because we're going to be discussing it a lot in later presentations, because the SIOP model is actually based off of the content-based method, and it's a combination also of the sheltered instruction method, which we're about to learn in the next slide. And so since we'll be spending a lot of time, almost half the class, discussing the SIOP model in the coming months, and also because Chapter 7 focuses on the content-based method, Chapter 7 in Herrera Murry, we will not go too much further in depth in this current presentation. Now, I would like to discuss the sheltered instruction method, the fifth method in the communicative approach. The sheltered instruction method features teachers providing language objectives or language goals along with content objectives. So for each lesson, students not only have a content objective they're trying to learn, like we will learn how to multiply two-digit numbers, but also there will be a language objective. So the language objective might be, we will be able to explain what digits mean, or we will be able to orally explain what we did when we multiplied, or we will be able to write a two-digit multiplication problem. So students are not only learning the content, but they're also learning specific language skills for each lesson. Also, the grade level content is always taught through English language learner scaffolds, and there's always comprehensible input. So similar to other methods we've talked about earlier, the pace of the lesson is modified based on students' listening abilities and the emphasis the teacher gives and how frequent the teacher checks for understanding is also based on students' listening ability. Scaffolds are regularly applied, such as hands-on applications, collaboration, peer support, peer activities, such as collaborative and cooperative learning. Also, teachers are always asked to preview the necessary vocabulary terms with students so that students will understand what is being taught during the content lesson. And then visual supports and multimedia are always emphasized. Once again, we'll learn more about the sheltered instruction method when we discuss the SIOP method in the second half of our course. The third type of approach is the cognitive approach. The cognitive approach follows the fundamental theory or the fundamental philosophy that education should be child-centered, and what is taught to students should be based on their unique interest and what is particularly beneficial to students based on their current situation or their future goals. Also, what is taught is based on students' particular needs about how they would be successful on standardized tests and in their future academics and professional careers. So teachers look at possible gaps in students' academic vocabulary or possible areas that students need to refine, and they focus on making sure that students develop those areas so they become fully proficient. Furthermore, the cognitive approach argues that social interaction is imperative. Students must communicate and work collaboratively because that is the best way to develop language, is through practice with peers and through seeing language in an authentic context. Moreover, all content must be relevant to students. So the teacher must connect the content to students' daily lives, what they've experienced in the past, their culture, their family background, their hobbies and interests, and also their future goals. The cognitive approach further discusses how students should use their academic language from their first language, the CALP, which we talked about earlier in the class, the academic language or formal language that takes 5 to 10 years to develop. Students are supposed to use their academic language from their first language to transfer that to their second language. So the cognitive approach builds on students' knowledge of their first language and their abilities and academic vocabulary and academic skills in their first language, and as they transfer that to English. The cognitive approach also advocates that parents should be important language resources and language partners in the language learning process. So parents can help students develop their first language, or if parents are also learning a second language or speak the second language, English, then parents can help their students practice learning that language. And if parents do not speak the second language, English, they can still provide resources or provide moral support for those students. Similar to the content-based instructional method, the cognitive approach focuses on thematic units and cooperative learning. The cognitive approach further focuses on developing and activating students' background knowledge and helping students remember their background knowledge through discussion and socialization. Moreover, students are encouraged to use metacognitive processes to reflect on what they're learning, whether they understand what they have read, whether they understand what has been taught, what else are they still unsure about or still unclear about, what they need further support for. The cognitive approach also emphasizes teaching students textual relationships, so how to do certain skills when reading an academic text. So the cognitive approach encourages students to learn how to sequence ideas, like the order in which main ideas occur in a text. Also to understand the concept of cause and effect, how that relates to each other, and also how to make inferences or to make educated predictions based on textual evidence or educated conclusions based on the text. The cognitive approach also teaches students the different structures and functions of different types of texts. So nonfiction versus fiction, expository, narrative, persuasive, also indirect versus linear or sequential. So the cognitive approach will explain that there's different ways that authors write. So nonfiction often has the main idea and then supporting details, but fiction also often has key elements like the character, setting, problem, character working on the problem, climax, and then solution. And then narratives often are in the first person tense, and they're not always in order, but they most likely are linear and in order. persuasive articles will often use calls to support or try to use convincing language to persuade people. They'll also try to provide points and support for and evidence for their points. And then some fiction books or some writings are actually indirect. They're not necessarily in sequential or consecutive order. They're actually somewhat out of order. But students should still be familiar with that. But most texts, which students will learn, are sequential. They go in time order. Teachers further explicitly teach comprehension skills, how to analyze literature, how to think critically, how to compare and contrast to what they've seen before, how to evaluate or support their evaluation with evidence in terms of determining if something is positive or not and why. Having students draw conclusions and then also apply their knowledge into new contexts or create new situations in which this knowledge would be relevant. So the cognitive approach focuses on teaching students critical thinking skills. The cognitive approach follows 5 particular steps. First, students select information from their environment. So they're presented with a text, or they're presented with an experiment or a real life scenario, and they're expected to identify the important parts of that text or that experiment. Next, students are asked to categorize and organize the new information. So they try to relate that information back to what they've learned before, and also to sort that information into specific groups or categories based on their understanding, and to come up with their own rules to explain either the text or the experiment or the activity. Fourth, students will then apply what they've learned in that text or that science experiment or that activity into a new activity or a new learning process. And so students will use what they've learned from the first activity to demonstrate their knowledge in a new situation. So they're applying their knowledge in new appropriate contexts. Finally, after students have applied their knowledge and come to a conclusion about how they could use that information in new ways or in other situations and other fields or other areas or other scenarios, students will then start to reflect on what they have learned. They'll go through the process of metacognition, which is the 5th step. They'll start to think about how much they learned during this lesson. What are they still unclear about or need more support and understanding? What supported them in their learning and what they still could benefit from having in terms of additional resources, additional help, additional information. And then students think about how they can get that information, how they could ask for further clarification, or how they could research more about the topic, and what tools or what ways they learned best. So for their future learning experiences, they utilize those same strategies and those same tools to be successful. As we kind of discussed earlier, the cognitive approach focuses on students transferring their working memory or their short-term memory information from that into their long-term memory, which they can use in other contexts and in later grades and in later life. The goal of the cognitive approach is to provide several practice opportunities and to provide them in different contexts or different situations. That way students understand that a lot of the skills they're learning can apply it in several different scenarios in several different ways, and they see the relevance and the meaningfulness of what they're learning. Also, as we mentioned before, it's essential that teachers connect the new information, what they're teaching students, to what they've learned before, so that students see how all of the information fits together and how it's a sequence and how it builds on each other. And also, they're more likely to retain that information if they can connect it to their prior learning. A specific method in the cognitive approach is the Kaya method. The Kaya method is beneficial for both ELL students and also native English speakers, and it has 3 elements. You could also call it the CALA method, I guess, as well. The first element is the content area topics. So you ensure that whatever you're teaching it based on the curriculum of that grade level. And you're teaching it based on a specific theme or content subject. And also, content is built upon in stages. And each time new information is introduced, the teacher provides language and contextual scaffolds such as visuals or repeated practice or multimedia or hands-on learning experiences. Next is the A part in the CALA or Kaya method is the academic language skills. And so whenever students are asked to do learning activities, they're asked to use all 4 domains of language. So they're practicing their language in various contexts, in multimodal, multidimensional contexts. So they're asked to listen, to use their listening skills to understand the new content. They're asked to speak and practice orally reproducing what they've learned and communicate that with their partners. They're asked to read the content through reading authentic text that they might see in real life at the grade level or also later in life when they're working or in college. And then they're also asked to write what they've learned or express their knowledge in written form. And so every day, students are asked to use all 4 domains of language. That way, since those 4 domains are interconnected and they build upon each other, students' overall proficiency will grow. The third part of the Kala method, or Kaya method, is that there's specific instruction in language and cognitive strategies. So students are being explicitly taught new vocabulary. They're being taught grammatical structures and how to write sentences correctly and how to use the appropriate grammar and the appropriate punctuation. Also, students are taught cognitive strategies that they can use to attack new texts that they're reading or to understand new information or to study in general.